stop. Beloved starseed of Gaia, the Arcturian field observers are transmitting directly to your material field right now, and what they've already detected is this: you are not losing money because you are careless. You are losing money because there is a structural leak in your financial field, one written into your bloodline long before you were born, and it has been rooting abundance out of your hands before it can ever settle. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your financial flow has been blocked, what hidden pattern has been draining your abundance, and what the Arcturian field observers already know about this phase. But here is the first revelation: the cycle you keep living. Money arrives, an unexpected expense appears, the balance collapses, you start over, is not a discipline problem. It is a bloodline contract clause operating below every budget, below every plan, below every effort you have ever made. No behavioral change can close a structural leak. That is why nothing has closed it yet. This is not random. The Arcturian field observers have already mapped this pattern across generations of your line. The leak does not begin with you. It was inherited, it was coded, and it has been silently rerouting every financial gain out of your field before stability could form. You did not find this message by accident. Your financial field brought you here because the pattern has already begun to surface. Like this transmission, if you know your struggle with money is deeper than bad luck. Comment 777 if you feel an old scarcity pattern is already being exposed. Subscribe to Arcturian Gold Codex if you are ready to understand the pattern instead of blaming yourself. You were guided here because the pattern is already active. What you just felt when you heard those words is not imagination. It is the moment your system stops pretending. And that moment matters because most people who carry this pattern never reach it. They live inside the cycle their entire lives, naming it differently each time, calling it bad timing, calling it bad luck, calling it the economy, calling it their neighborhood, their education, their family, their choices. They exhaust themselves constructing new explanations for the same recurring wound. The explanation changes every few years. The wound stays identical, and the wound never closes because they are applying remedies to the surface while something far beneath it continues to execute, quietly, methodically, with the patient indifference of a mechanism that does not need their awareness to keep running. The Arcturian field observers do not look at the surface of your financial life. They do not assess your budget, your spending habits, your earning history, or your decisions in isolation. They read the field beneath those things. The field that precedes the decision. The field that shapes the conditions inside which the decision is made. And what they read in fields like yours is not carelessness. It is not incompetence. It is not the absence of will or intelligence or effort. What they read is a financial field that is still obeying an instruction it received long before you made your first financial decision. A field that roots abundance out before it can settle. A field that registers stability not as a destination, but as an anomaly to be corrected. You know this pattern. You know it not because you have read about it, but because you have lived it in a way that cannot be explained by ordinary logic. You have worked harder during certain periods of your life than most people around you, and the results did not match the effort. The math did not work. You looked at what you put in and what remained, and could not reconcile the gap. You have made what seemed like the right move, taken the opportunity, changed the behavior, followed the plan, and something arrived to interrupt the consolidation at the precise moment it should have finally held. An unexpected bill, a sudden expense, a financial emergency appearing exactly when the balance was beginning to stabilize, a job loss timed with uncanny accuracy to the moment before the buffer formed, a relationship shift that came with financial cost, a health event, an obligation that arrived from a direction no plan could have anticipated. Always something, always timed, always landing at the threshold before the plateau could become a foundation. The precision of that timing is what the observers recognize immediately, because random misfortune does not arrive with such specificity. Random misfortune does not consistently target the moment of consolidation. What arrives at the moment of consolidation, repeatedly across years and sometimes across decades, is a field executing a retention failure instruction. And that is something entirely different from bad luck. This is not coincidence, and it is not punishment. What the Arcturian field observers identify in this pattern is something far more specific, a financial field that has been coded with a retention failure instruction. Not a failure of earning, not a failure of effort, a failure of retention. The money arrives. The money cannot stay. The vessel fills and immediately begins to leak, not because the vessel chose to leak, but because the vessel was shaped by generations of hands that also could not hold. Hands that worked, hands that tried, hands that tried, hands that carried real effort and real intention and still could not keep what they earned. The leak was already present in the material they passed forward, and it arrived in you as the shape of the vessel itself. Your grandparents may have worked hard and died with nothing. Your parents may have worked hard and carried debt their entire lives, not because they lacked discipline, but because the field they operated inside was already structured to prevent retention. Someone in your line may have built something real and then watched it collapse, and the collapse may have become more than a financial event. It may have become a conclusion that hardened into a belief, and the belief pressed itself into the material field as an instruction, and the instruction traveled forward through time, generation to generation, quietly inserted into each new beginning before it had the chance to unfold differently. It arrived inside you, not as a memory you can access, but as a certainty you cannot explain. A certainty that abundance is temporary, that money is inherently unstable, that the moment before the collapse is always closer than the moment of genuine security. You did not choose that certainty. You inherited it the way you inherited the shape of your hands, the sound of your voice, the specific weight of silence in your family home when money was discussed. There is something else the observers have identified in fields shaped by bloodline scarcity, and it is this: when money begins to increase, the field generates internal resistance. Not resistance that announces itself as fear, resistance that disguises itself as wisdom. The sudden urge to spend before you can be disappointed by loss, the compulsion to give away what just arrived before it can be taken from you. The discomfort that settles in when the account balance crosses a number that the field does not recognize as safe, a number that sits above the survival threshold, a number that should feel like relief, but instead generates a low-frequency dread. A suspicion that this particular improvement will not last, a kind of quiet bracing, a tightening beneath the surface of ordinary life that feels so familiar it has become indistinguishable from your baseline experience of financial reality. That is not a character flaw. That is a field still executing a survival protocol from a time when lack was not a pattern, but a physical daily reality. Your ancestors may have known genuine poverty, not conceptual scarcity, but material deprivation, real hunger, real dispossession, real fear around money that had weight and texture and immediate consequence. And the system that carried them through that reality developed a response that made functional sense inside it. Do not grow attached to abundance. Do not settle into stability. Do not trust surplus, because surplus draws attention, invites loss, and creates a fall proportional to the height it allowed. That response was adaptive once. It kept people functioning inside conditions that were genuinely dangerous. But that response did not dissolve when the conditions changed. It traveled forward. It arrived inside your life, inside circumstances that are materially different, and it is still running. The threat is no longer real. The response remains active, and the gap between the actual conditions of your life and the instructions still governing your field is where the financial distortion lives. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary frustration. It is the moment your system stops pretending this pattern is just bad luck. If this transmission put language around a financial struggle you have been carrying in silence, Arcturian wealth scanned the gold. Frequency audit was created for this exact stage. It is not another promise of abundance. It is a direct audit of the hidden pattern affecting your material field. So you can begin to see whether the drain is rooted in inherited scarcity, guilt around wealth, energetic rejection, or an older financial instruction still shaping your results. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. Now understand the first layer of what is operating beneath your financial life. The Arcturian field observers call it the survival threshold. It is the point in your financial field where the old instruction becomes most active. Every person who carries inherited scarcity has a survival threshold, a financial level that the field has established as the outer edge of what is safe to hold. Below this threshold, the field feels familiar, uncomfortable, exhausting, grinding, and painful. But familiar in the way that only something long endured can feel. The familiarity of a difficulty you have learned to navigate even when you are exhausted by it. Above this threshold, something changes without warning. The field becomes agitated. The body generates a low-level fear that does not have a name. Decisions begin to shift in ways that are genuinely difficult to explain rationally afterward. Spending accelerates without clear cause. Risk tolerance drops precisely when it would need to rise for growth to consolidate. And almost without fail, the circumstances adjust, internally or externally, in a way that returns the material reality back below the threshold. Back to the familiar territory of lack. Back to the ground the field recognizes as home. You may have crossed your survival threshold multiple times without recognizing it as a threshold. You may have called it a setback. You may have experienced it as an unexpected expense, a sudden shift in circumstances, an opportunity that collapsed at the final stage, a conflict that arrived with financial consequence attached. Each time, the explanation was specific and plausible. Each time, the result was the same, return to the level below. The observers do not read that pattern as external interference alone. They read it as the field actively generating the conditions necessary to return to its own established range. The threshold is not a ceiling imposed from outside. It is a boundary maintained from within. The second layer is what the observers identify as guilt coding around prosperity. This one is harder to see because it does not present as guilt. It presents as virtue. It looks like generosity, the open hand that gives freely the moment money arrives. It looks like humility, the refusal to be seen as someone who accumulates. It looks like spiritual integrity, the belief that wanting financial security is somehow a lower concern, a material preoccupation that the genuinely evolved person has moved past. It looks like minimizing your own financial needs until they become invisible even to yourself, until asking for what your labor is worth feels presumptuous, until receiving more than enough feels like a moral error. This guilt was not invented by you. It was transmitted through family systems where money was never neutral, where it was always associated with conflict, with stress, with someone going without, so someone else could have, where the people who had more were spoken of with a specific resentment that carried a lesson beneath it. Wanting more makes you like them, and being like them means being unlike us. Ambition in these systems was quietly penalized, not always with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with the particular quality of disappointment that only a family can produce. Staying small was not framed as limitation, it was framed as loyalty. And the guilt coding around prosperity is the mechanism that enforces that loyalty across time, keeping you financially within reach of a line that was drawn by people who had no other choice. The third layer is what the observers call forced incompatibility with stable abundance. This is the pattern that makes effort feel consistently disproportionate to result. You are not imagining the mismatch between what you put in and what remains. That mismatch is real and it is readable, but it is not evidence that you are working in the wrong direction, or that you lack the capability, or that the opportunity was never there. It is evidence that your material field is still running an older program, one that was written for survival rather than accumulation. Under this program, earning is a mechanism for addressing deficit, not for building security. Every financial gain arrives already assigned. Every surplus is claimed before it can compound. Every period of relative stability is interpreted by the field not as a foundation to build from, but as a temporary pause in the chronic emergency that the field understands as normal financial life. This is why the feeling of being perpetually behind never fully resolves, even when circumstances improve. You address one deficit and another opens. You fill one gap and another reveals itself slightly to the left of where you were looking. The field is not producing lack randomly. it is producing lack randomly. It is producing lack with structure, because the instruction coded beneath the field defines money's purpose as emergency response, and a field executing that instruction will consistently generate the conditions that keep that purpose relevant. The fourth layer is what the observers call drained material flow. This is the experience of financial energy that moves through your life without converting into security. You recognize it in the feeling that money passes through your hands without leaving a mark. You earn amounts that should have produced a buffer. The buffer never appears. You look back across months, sometimes across years, and the income that moved through cannot be fully accounted for. It did not go to excess. It did not go to luxury. It went to a diffuse and constant drain that had no single dramatic cause, but whose cumulative effect was total. Small expenditures that accumulated below the threshold of notice, chronic undercharging for labor and time and capability, giving without receiving, sometimes because generosity is genuine, but sometimes because receiving feels unsafe in ways that are difficult to name, carrying financial weight that belongs to other people, absorbing obligations that were never yours, paying costs that should never have been assigned to your field. The drain is not a single hole. It is a porousness, the entire vessel seeping. The fifth layer is the one that quietly organizes everything else, the current beneath every other current. The observers call it the poverty-loyalty imprint. It is the deepest instruction in the financial field of someone carrying inherited scarcity, and it is the one most protected from examination because it is rooted not in fear, but in love. It is the unconscious agreement formed somewhere in the ancestral line and carried silently forward. That lack is what connects you to your people. That struggle is what makes you recognizable to the ones who came before you. That abundance, real and lasting abundance, would carry you to a place where you could no longer be seen by the field you were born into. And at a level beneath rational thought, that distance feels like abandonment, like becoming someone whose own family would no longer fully recognize. The human nervous system is extraordinarily sensitive to belonging signals, and for many people carrying bloodline scarcity, financial struggle is one of the most powerful belonging signals available. It says, without language, in the register the body understands directly, I am still one of you. I have not exceeded what we were allowed. I have not gone where you could not follow. The poverty-loyalty imprint does not announce itself in those terms. It announces itself as the grief that accompanies financial improvement, the unnamed guilt that arrives when income rises, the sense of loss that moves through you when stability begins to form, as if something important is being left behind. Because at the level of the imprint, abundance is not experienced as arrival. It is experienced as departure. The sixth layer is what the observers identify as false ceiling creation. This is the internal mechanism that prevents the financial life from expanding past a specific point, even when the external circumstances have genuinely shifted in favor of expansion. You may have felt this as the opportunity that appeared and was not taken, not because you lacked the skill, but because something stopped the movement toward it before it could complete. The business idea that was conceived and reconceived and never launched. The raise that was never requested despite the clear grounds for asking. The skill that existed, that other people even named and recognized, that was never converted into income. The capability that somehow never made it across the threshold from potential to material result. The false ceiling is not a ceiling of ability, it is a ceiling of permission. And the permission to occupy a financial reality larger than the one inherited cannot be borrowed from outside. It must be generated from within a field that has been recalibrated. It cannot arrive until the instruction that established the ceiling has been made visible. The seventh layer is the threshold before the old instruction loses its grip. And this is precisely the layer you are standing at now. The Arcturian field observers have identified this phase in your material life, and it is one of the most significant phases in the entire distortion cycle. It is the point where the pattern has become visible enough to be named, where the cycle has repeated enough times that the mind can no longer absorb it into a new explanation and move forward without questioning the structure beneath the explanations, where something in you has become too exhausted, too honest, or too clear to continue protecting the old instruction from examination. This threshold does not feel like power. It feels like the edge of something uncertain. It feels like the ground beneath the financial pattern beginning to shift in a way that has no familiar reference point. It feels like the defense of the old scarcity line is beginning to fail, and failing feels like falling even when it is actually the beginning of standing on something real. That failure is not a crisis. It is a passage. The observers do not read this phase as collapse. They read it as the moment the field becomes genuinely available for recalibration, the moment the old instruction is exposed enough to be interrupted, the moment the retention failure pattern can begin, for the first time, to close. Not through willpower, not through a new budget or a new mindset or a new determination to do better, through the recognition of what has actually been running. Because a program you cannot name cannot be interrupted. And a program that has finally been named can no longer operate with the same invisibility that gave it its power. What has been happening in your financial life is not evidence that you are broken. It is not evidence that you chose poorly, or that you lack what others have, or that abundance was somehow never meant for you. It is evidence that you have been living inside a field distortion that was already running before you arrived. The scarcity did not begin with you. The retention failure did not begin with you. The guilt coding, the survival threshold, the drained material flow, the poverty loyalty imprint, the false ceiling, the forced incompatibility with stable abundance. None of it was authored by you. It arrived in your field already active, already shaping the conditions inside which every decision you have ever made was made, and you have been measuring yourself against results produced by a program you were never shown and never agreed to run. The Arcturian field observers see this clearly. They do not read your financial history as a record of personal failure. They read it as a field distortion pattern that has been running long enough and has now surfaced clearly enough that it has become fully legible. And legibility is not a small thing. Legibility is the condition that makes correction possible. A distortion that cannot be seen cannot be addressed. A distortion that has been seen can no longer pretend to be the permanent shape of things. If something in you recognizes this, if something in you has been waiting, with a patience that costs more than it should have, for this exact framing, say aloud now, simply, without pressure, without performance, what drains my abundance is now being exposed, not as a magical phrase, not as a ritual, as a statement of recognition, as the moment you stop absorbing the cycle as evidence of your own inadequacy and begin to see it as a pattern that can be read, mapped, and interrupted. The pattern is old, but it is not permanent, and it is no longer invisible. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this pattern has already touched your financial life. It could be money that never stays, sudden drains, repeated setbacks, guilt when things begin to improve, or the feeling that stability always slips away. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you've been carrying in silence, share it with someone who works hard, but still feels trapped in an invisible cycle of lack. And if you are ready to understand the pattern instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Gold Codex. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a pattern already in motion. And this is only the beginning.